right, I'm back with Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. Today we're going to read The Selfishness Cure. Richard Thompson was certainly a nice-looking boy, and he was smart in school and behaved well. But at the table, whenever his name was mentioned, people said, Poor Miss Thompson. She has such a problem. What will she ever do with that child? I guess that you would feel simply dreadful if people said a thing like that when your name was mentioned. But Richard didn't. You see, Richard Thompson was a selfish, greedy boy, and he cared more about being selfish, greedy boy than about what people said. When children came over to his house to play, Richard said, "Don't touch that, that's mine. You can't play with that, that's mine. Put down my ball, take off my skates." Each time this happened, at least each time that it happened where his mother could hear Richard saying, "That's mine," she would send him up to his room to think about how selfish he was. Richard would go right upstairs, for he was very obedient. But instead of thinking how bad it was to be selfish, he would sit on the bed and swing his legs and think, "Everything in this room is mine, and nobody's going to touch my things." He certainly was a problem. One day, Richard's mother brought a big box of peppermint sticks. She called Richard into the house and said, "Now, dear, I have bought this large box of peppermint sticks for you, but I want you to share them with your friends. There are about 50 sticks in the box, and I want you to divide them with all the children in the neighborhood. And don't forget the little children, Richard. And you might send one or two to old Miss Barry. She is so fond of peppermint." Richard said, "Thank you, Mother, for the fine candy," and then he took the box out of the doors and put it in the basket in front of his bicycle and allowed the neighborhood children to look at the peppermint sticks. But he warned them, "This is my candy, and if anyone touches it, I will hit him with my baseball bat." The children in his neighborhood had known Richard for some time, and they knew that he meant what he said. But as they looked at the candy, they wished and wished they could have just one stick. Richard's mother was watching from the window and saw the children gathered around Richard and the box of candy in the basket in front of his bicycle, and she thought to herself, "Just look at my little Richard, dividing the candy with all of his little friends. I just knew he would learn to be generous." And she tapped on the window, and when Richard looked around, she waved and smiled at him. Richard waved and smiled back, but unfortunately just then Mary O'Toole, who was quite darling, reached in and grabbed a stick of candy, and crack! Richard clouted her on the hand with the baseball bat. In a flash, his mother saw what was really going on. She flew out the front door and took Richard firmly by the arm and marched him upstairs, thrust him into his room, and slammed the door. Then she went downstairs and out the front door, took the box of candy, told Mary O'Toole to divide it up among all the children, even the little ones, and to take one or two sticks over to Miss Barry because she was so fond of peppermint. He got caught, didn't he? He wasn't sharing it. There were 15 children, not counting Richard, and 50 sticks of candy, so each child was given 3 sticks, and old Miss Barry got 5. From the window of his bedroom, Richard saw Mary divide the candy, and he was just furious. After all the candy had been divided, Miss Thompson went into the house and called Richard's father. She said, "Herbert, I know that you are busy and you don't like to have me call you at the office, but I am worried about Richard." Richard's father said, "What's the matter? Is he sick?" Richard's mother said, "No, but I just wish he were. It would be so much simpler." Mrs. Thompson said, "Now, dear, I am very busy, so perhaps you better wait until I come home." Mrs. Thompson said, "Herbert, this cannot wait another minute," and she told him about the candy and the baseball bat. Mr. Thompson said, "Why not give him a good hard spanking? Tell him that you're going to give him something that he can keep all to himself." Now, Herbert, this is not a laughing matter, and I don't think a spanking will solve a thing. I just don't know what to do or which way to turn. And Mrs. Thompson began to cry, partly because she felt so humiliated over Richard's selfishness, and partly because she knew that she was crying was the one way to get action out of Richard's father. Richard's father said, Now, dear, tears won't help. Let me see. Shall I hop into a taxi and come home and thrash Richard?" Richard's mother only cried louder. Richard's father said, I know just what to do. Call that Miss Wiggle-Spiggle, or whatever her name is. You know, the one who cured Hubert Prentice." "You mean Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle?" "Oh, Herbert, you are so wonderful. I knew that you would think of something. I'll call her right away." And Mrs. Thompson blew her nose and cheered right up. Mothers always do cheer up when they think of Miss Piggle-Wiggle because she knows so much about children. After all, she has had about 1,000 little boys and girls come to her house and pull taffy, play checkers, bake cookies, drink tea, and dig for old pirate gold buried in the backyard. And so she had plenty of opportunity to learn about childish cures for them. When she was certainly the person to ask about Richard, the selfish boy, and so Mrs. Thompson telephoned her. "Hello, Miss Piggle-Wiggle. This is Mrs. Thompson, Richard's mother." Miss Piggle-Wiggle said, "Hello, Mrs. Thompson. I have rather expected you to call." Miss Thompson said, "You have? Why?" "Because I know Richard very well," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, "and although he is a dear little boy and the most well-mannered child who comes to visit me, never once forgetting to say thank you and please, he is very selfish." "Oh, I know he is, said Mrs. Thompson, almost crying because she was so ashamed that Miss Piggle-Wiggle should know how selfish Richard was. Miss Piggle-Wiggle said, "Now, Mrs. Thompson, do not feel sad. Selfishness and greediness are just like diseases, like the measles and the chicken pox, and can be cured very easily. But we must start now, before another day passes, because Richard is such a nice little boy and we want everyone to like him as we do." "Oh, do you like him in spite of his selfishness?" asked his mother. "Of course I do," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. "I love all children, but it distresses me when I see a child who has a disease like selfishness or answer-backism or won't put away toys, and his parents don't do a thing to cure him." "But I want to cure Richard," said his mother. "I will do anything to cure him." Miss Piggle-Wiggle said, "The selfishness cure is really very simple, but the rules must be followed very strictly. You will have to come down here and get my selfishness kit, and at the same time, I will give you the directions for its use." "Thank you so much, dear Miss Piggle-Wiggle," said Miss Thompson. "I will leave right now." And she hung up the phone and slipped on a jacket and ran all the way to Miss Piggle-Wiggle's house. When she arrived, Miss Piggle-Wiggle was on the front porch waiting for her. On the porch beside her was a quite large green metal box with selfishness kit painted on the side with white letters. Miss Piggle-Wiggle invited Richard's mother in to sit down, and then she opened the kit. Inside were about 25 padlocks of various sizes. There was great big ones about the size of apples, down to tiny ones not much larger than a penny. Also, there were screws and a screwdriver and a box of cloth labels that said Richard. A box with black gummed labels and a small can of white paint, a small can of black paint, a small paintbrush, and a pastry bag. This is a large bag with a nozzle on the end, which, when filled with frosting, can be squeezed and the frosting comes out the end like toothpaste and can be used to form words. Miss Piggle-Wiggle said, "Miss Thompson, these padlocks are for Richard's drawers, his closets, his toy chest, his bicycle, his bedroom door, his nightstand drawer, and his toothbrush. As soon as you get home, put the padlocks on everything he owns and give him the keys. This is to assure him that he, and only he alone, can touch his things. The name labels are to be sewn on all of his clothes, and gummed stickers are to be put on all of his books, even his school books. Notebooks, pencil boxes are to be pasted on his ruler, crayons, and paints. On each sticker, don't print large letters. On each sticker, print in large letters with black paint, Richard's book, don't touch. Richard's notebook, don't touch. And so forth. On every toy he owns, you must paint in either black or white, Richard's ball, don't touch. Or Richard's bat, don't touch. Put the name of the toy first, and then don't touch. The pastry bag is to be filled with a simple white frosting and used to mark Richard's sandwiches, his fruits, his cookies, and his plate for each meal. That's all there is to it. I expect you will be turning the selfishness kit before a week has passed. So they're going to put his name on everything, even down to his food. Mrs. Thompson said, I do hope so, Miss Piggle-Wiggle. Are you sure it'll work? It has cured hundreds of other children, and I see no reason why it should not cure Richard. A week, or even less, I should say. Miss Thompson thanked Miss Piggle-Wiggle very much, and then, lugging the kit, walked home. As soon as she had hung up her jacket and began sewing the labels in all of Richard's clothes, he asked her what she was doing, and when she showed him, he was happy. Happy as could be. Boy, that'll just show people who owns my clothes, he said proudly. Miss Thompson did not answer, but continued to put the labels on every single stitch on his clothing, including his socks and his handkerchiefs. Then she opened the kit and took out the tiniest padlock. She fastened Richard's toothbrush to the toothbrush rack with a little padlock and snapped it shut and handed the key, which was not much bigger than a pin, to Richard. You had better find a ring holder for your keys, she said. You're going to have about 25 of them. Boy, that's just wonderful, Richard said, fondling the tiny key and thinking, that's my toothbrush, and now nobody but me can touch it. He was very happy. When dinner time came, Miss Thompson closed the selfishness kit and took it down to Richard's father. She told him about Miss Piggle-Wiggle, and he patted her on the back and said that he was sure everything would be all right, and where was the evening paper. After dinner, they went upstairs and put some of the padlocks on, and were surprised to find that Richard himself had already put the padlocks on each of his bureau drawers, his nightstand drawer, his toy box, his closet, his bedroom door. He had also put stickers on the covers of all his books, notebooks, coloring books, crayons, colored pencils, and stamp albums. On the stickers, he had printed in black paint, Richard's book, don't touch. Richard's notebook, don't touch. Richard's crayons, don't touch. Richard's pencil box, don't touch. Richard's stamp album, don't touch. He was very proud and asked his father if he didn't think he printed well. His father said, you should be able to print well. You have certainly practiced enough. He looked disgustedly around the room at the stickers, which labeled everything. Richard's brush, don't touch. Richard's comb, don't touch. Richard's window blind, don't touch. He turned to Richard's mother and said, perhaps we should wear stickers. Richard's mother, don't touch. Richard's father, don't touch. I bet he'll wear the monogrammed underwear when he grows up. They think he's going to have his name stitched onto his underwear even when he's a grown-up. Miss Thompson said, oh, I hope not, Hubert. Richard said, come on, Mom and Dad, let's mark all the rest of my stuff. And so they worked until 8:30, marking Richard's bicycle, his baseball, his bat, his pitcher's glove, his catcher's glove, his toolbox, his roller skates, his lunchbox, his rubber boots, his raincoat, his Indian suit, his soldier suit, his gun, his wagon, and they even painted Richard's dog, don't touch, on Rover's collar. When they had finished, it was time for Richard to go to bed. He kissed his mother and said good night to his father and went happily up the stairs, his ring of keys jingling from his belt. Mrs. Thompson sank down in a chair in the living room Mr. Thompson sank down into the chair in the living room and had lit his pipe. I trust that Miss Piggle-Wiggle knows what she's doing, he said, because if this cure should not work, our son Richard is going to be the most loathsome boy in the whole world. Miss Thompson said, oh, no, dear, not in the whole world. The next morning they heard Richard clicking and snapping at his padlocks long before they were up. He was a little late coming downstairs because it took time to padlock all of his drawers, his closet door, and the door of his room. But he was very happy, and his mother noticed that he had pinned one of his name labels on the outside of his sweater. While he was eating his breakfast marked, "Richard's breakfast don't touch," his mother marked his sandwiches, "Richard's sandwiches don't touch," and his apple, "Richard's apple don't touch," and his cookies, "Richard's cookies don't touch," and his lunchbox had already been marked, "Richard's lunchbox don't touch." After breakfast, Richard put the lunchbox in the basket on his bicycle and proudly on a large sign hanging from the crossbar, "Richard's bicycle don't touch." At school, the children paid little attention to the sign on his bicycle, but when he opened his lunchbox and took out the sandwiches marked, "Richard's sandwiches don't touch," and the apples, "Richard's apple don't touch," and the cookies marked, "Richard's cookies don't touch," everyone laughed and wanted to see them, and resulting in crowding and pushing, one of the sandwiches was dropped and stepped on, and some of the big boys grabbed the apple and tossed it in the air above Richard's head, shouting, "Throw me Richard's apple! Oh, look, I dropped Richard's apple!" I wonder if Richard's apple will bounce. When they finally gave Richard his apple, it was bruised and very dirty. So the kids at school are making fun of his food, aren't they? In arithmetic period after that, Bobby Slater crossed the aisle and asked Richard for his ruler. And when he saw the label, "Richard's ruler don't touch," he began to laugh and reached over and snatched the ruler off Richard's desk and passed it to Kenny Hatch, who laughed and passed it to the girl in front of him, and finally Miss Crabtree had come down to get it. When she saw the sign, she laughed too, but she gave the ruler back to Richard. After school, the boys decided to play baseball in the vacant lot by Richard's house. But when Richard brought his ball and bat and mitts and the boys saw, "Richard's ball don't touch, Richard's bat don't touch," they said, "We can't touch anything, so let's go home." And they did. So he can't play with anybody if his stuff's marked that it's just his. Richard went to his room to play, but he found that somewhere during the day he had lost the key to his closet and that he had locked the key to his toy chest in the chest. So when he went down and sat on the front porch and listened to the shouts of the children playing in Hubert Prentice's yard. So he's starting to lose his keys. The next morning at school during recess, nobody would play with him, and the little girls followed him and laughed. When they marched into school, the children pointed and laughed, and Miss Crabtree came down to see what the trouble was, and she almost laughed herself when she saw the sign that someone had pinned on the back of Richard's sweater. It said, "This is Richard, don't touch." At lunchtime, the children crowded around to watch him take out his sandwiches, and one little girl said, "He's so selfish and greedy. He has his sandwiches marked so he can't share them." Then the children danced around him and chanted, "Richard's sandwich don't touch, Richard's apple don't touch, Richard's lunchbox don't touch." And finally, Richard took his lunchbox out and put it in the basket in his bicycle, but the children followed him, seeing the big sign, "Richard's bicycle don't touch." And they yelled and they laughed and they sang, "Richard's don't touch Richard, Richard, don't touch Richard." So the kids are making fun of his signs, aren't they? After school, Richard hurried home, but he had lost the keys to his room, so when he went down to the basement to play with his toolbox, but every time he saw the large white sign, "Richard's toolbox don't touch," he thought of school and the lunchbox, and he remembered how the children laughed and jeered, and he was ashamed. And at dinner, when his mother brought him his plate, "Richard's dinner don't touch," he said, "Oh, why do you have to mark my plate? I don't care which one I get." He used to, didn't he? Mrs. Thompson looked significantly at Mr. Thompson and said, "All right, Richard, we won't mark your plate if you will share your dessert with Rover." You think he'll give his dog some of his dessert? Richard thought for a few minutes, and then he carefully broke his chocolate cake into 2 equal pieces and gave one to Rover, who gulped it down and looked grateful. After dinner, Richard told his father that he had lost the keys to his room and the closet, and so his father took off the padlocks on those doors and on the toy box, and Richard said, "Don't put them back, Dad. I don't care who goes in my room or who gets into my stuff." The next morning, Richard got up early and scraped Richard's lunchbox, "Don't touch," from his lunchbox and took the sign off of his bicycle. Then he went to his mother and said, "Mom, don't mark my sandwiches. Please don't mark any of my stuff, Mom." Miss Thompson said, "All right, Richard. I only did it to protect you." Richard said, "I don't care who gets my lunch. Just don't mark it." At noon, all the children gathered round Richard, but neither his sandwiches nor his apple nor his lunchbox were marked. So they rushed out to see his bicycle, but there was no sign. So they sat down and ate their lunches. Right after school that night, Richard hurried home, scraped the marking off his ball and bat and mitts, and then he walked up to where the children were playing ball and tossing the ball, bat and mitts down beside the catcher and said, "Do you want to see these? I don't care." And he went back to his own house. In a little while, Mary O'Toole rang the doorbell and asked Miss Thompson if Richard could come out and play. Miss Thompson said he'd love to, Mary, but first he must return something to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. Mary said, "Tell him to come over to the lot when he gets back. There are some keys that he lost." Miss Thompson said, "Thank you for the keys, dear, but thank goodness they belong to Miss Piggle-Wiggle, not to Richard." She took the keys off the big padlock and the tiny padlock up to Richard, who was in his room, busily packing Miss Piggle-Wiggle's selfishness kit. So did Richard learn his lesson? He doesn't want to be selfish anymore, does he? He wants his friends to not laugh at him and make fun of him and sing about him. Don't touch, don't touch, don't touch. And he wants to be able to play. And if his toys are marked just for him, his friends can't play with him. And he wants to be able to eat lunch without being made fun of, right? He doesn't want his clothes to name him. Oh, sorry, I just saw a bug. Tomorrow we will read The Radish Cure. I'll show you a quick picture. Looks like we got a cat and a girl. Looks like a bathtub. Wonder what that could be about. We'll find out tomorrow. I'll see you guys. Bye.